Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, and no, your ears are not deceiving you. This is Alexis back on the podcast, but I'm not alone.
I'm here too, but we're going to let Alexis actually be in the piloting chair of the magical What If machine. It's been I guess it's been more than a couple of weeks since you've actually been on an episode. You've been busy doing some other stuff, so it's good to have Alexis back to be engaged today in our topic today. And of course, Alexis is back, so
I'm laughing.
yeah, long-term listeners will know where we're likely to go. So where are we likely to go, Lex?
We're going to London, but it's a timely topic.
I agree, it's a timely topic. And why is it a timely topic?
Because we're in the span of dates that this event happened. This is a multi-day event we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, and it's a multi-day event in London in what year?
1666.
1666. And so what happens in early September of 1666 in London for those who may not already know when they hear that date?
There's a little fire that breaks out.
A little fire. So much so that they call it the Little Fire of London?
No, it's the Great Fire.
The Great
of
Fire.
London.
Yeah, it was interesting as I was doing a little research here. There's been enough fires in London that you have to actually distinguish which
you have
fire.
To delineate.
Which fire you're talking about. So we're talking about the Great Fire of London in September of 1666.
Yes.
And so obviously what we do here on the podcast is we just spend an entire 30 minutes to an hour just talking about history, right?
No.
No. What do we do here on the podcast?
Well, we had to talk about a little history, but then we're going to talk about what would have happened if there was no fire.
Ah, so this is a what-if situation.
Yes.
All right, so...
I know, I'm a little out of practice, guys. It's been a few weeks, but I think that's what we do here.
That's what we do here on A Fork in Time, is that we look at a what-if path. So today, obviously, as we've suggested here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the historical what-if there had been no 1666. I almost said 1966. If there had been no 1666 Great Fire of London.
Yep.
And so we'll explore that what-if after we hear a little bit here from some of the folks that help make the podcast possible. We invite you to come back. Alexis and Don here, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to actually talk about the technology that we're using to bring you the podcast. We're going to talk about Buzzsprout, which is where we host A Fork in Time. Now, you may get our podcast via a number of the other podcatchers, the other ways that podcasts are syndicated. So you might be listening on Apple Podcasts, you might be listening on Google Podcasts, you might be listening on Stitcher. But Alexis, where do we post the podcast at?
On Buzzsprout.
On Buzzsprout. And when we started A Fork in Time, I got to be honest with you, I guess I'd read a few things. I was familiar with a couple of different podcast hosting sites because I'd heard their names being a podcast listener, but I had no idea what was really going to be involved with setting up a podcast. And I can tell you, it's actually pretty easy. Wouldn't you agree, Alexis?
Yes.
And the reason it's pretty easy that Buzzsprout's there to help you through every part of the process. And so what Buzzsprout is they're not just a hosting service, but they give you suggestions, and they're a platform that really helps podcasts of any size be able to get their word out. In fact, so much so that over 100,000 podcasts actually call Buzzsprout home.
Yep.
And so what we have for our listeners is an opportunity to help support the podcast and also utilize Buzzsprout services. So all you have to do is follow the link in the show notes. And if you do, because you're looking to start a podcast, they'll walk you through, believe me, they'll walk you through very easily on the website what you need to do. And if you choose to move forward there, we actually get a benefit from that. So I think I would call that, what's the word that we use for that, Alexis?
Win-win?
Win-win is the word that we use for that. And again, some of the things that I've already mentioned is we use Buzzsprout. We find it very easy to use. Uploading an episode each week, I think, is
super simple, and they even send you stats every week, which get a little addicting to look at.
I agree with that. In fact, that's another interesting thing that I didn't even, I guess, fully realize as we were starting, that immediately we'd be able to start seeing stats, not only about how many downloads, how many listens, but where in the world people are listening, all of that kind of thing. So it's not just a place to host a podcast. It's really the full support that's there. There's other affiliations that they have that allow either a novice podcaster or an experienced podcaster to get the podcast up and growing. So we don't consider anyone starting a podcast to be a competitor because we're all in this space together. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast, what would you recommend our listeners do, Lex?
Go to Buzzsprout. It's a good starting point.
I would agree. And so all you need to do is follow the link in our show notes and go there and you'll see what's available for you. So we'd encourage you to do that. So Buzzsprout, it's the home of A Fork in Time, and it could be home of your podcast as well.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. It's Alexis, of course, but I'm not alone. I've got Dawn with me. And of course, because I'm in the host chair, guess where we're going? If you remember from before the break, we're going to London, and we're gonna discover what would have happened if the Great Fire of London had not taken place.
And so again, the year is 1666, and as we often say, it's the What If podcast, but we often have to start with the what did. So let's talk a little bit about the what did.
Sure.
What's going on in London? This is September of 1666. But this is actually not the first sort of calamity or situation that London has been dealing with during this particular time, right?
Yeah, no, they were dealing with something fairly recently on 1665, the Great Plague of London.
So apparently the middle 1660s are all about...
It wasn't a good decade.
Yeah, and it's all about things that are great, but not for the good reasons in London. So the Great Plague of London, 65, 66 are the years that are normally associated with that, and pretty substantial. I read one thing where the population of London is estimated to be about 400,000 people prior to the plague, and maybe as much as a quarter of the population dies as a result of the plague.
Yeah, so it was a quite a catastrophic occurrence of plague that happened in 1665 and leading into 1666. So that's the buildup, so to speak, of where we're getting to with this fire.
Yeah, so again, by the time you get to September of 1666, it's not like everything has been fine and dandy.
Yeah, no.
And it's been about a year. Although by the time we get to, and we'll talk a little bit this, we talk about the departure on the what if. By the time we get to September of 1666, at least there's some evidence that the impact of the plague itself is in decline.
Yeah, it's waning a little bit. It's waning a little bit, but there's definitely still instances of plague going on.
Okay. And again, this is, historians believe this is another outbreak, another form of the bubonic plague, and actually probably one of the most impactful instances of the bubonic plague that's happened in England or in London.
Yes.
Yeah, and so if you think back to this period of time, actually go way, way back in the podcast history here, we did a series of episodes around, I think, 11, 12, 13 that were actually on the Black Death. And the Black Death, as I mentioned during those series of episodes, if you want to think about it just being a singular event, it wasn't a singular event. There were multiple instances of the plague and even of the Black Death in Europe. So it wasn't just a once-and-done kind of thing. Over a period of time of about 100 to 150 years, there were the major outbreaks of the plague in certain areas and then recurrences. And so this really was not a singular event. And actually, by the time of 1666, there had ceased to be the same type of outbreaks in Europe on the continent proper. And so this outbreak in London was a little bit unique or a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, our departure today is not about what if there had been no Great Plague.
We've already talked about that.
It's actually about the Great Fire. So as we come to September of 1666, there's a pretty substantial event called a fire.
Mm-hmm.
So what was destroyed during the Great Fire of London?
It's more a question of what wasn't destroyed in the Great Fire of London. Several buildings, several plots of land, several important landmarks were destroyed. The interesting thing about the Great Fire of London, only about 10 people actually died. So it was not a catastrophic event in terms of lives lost. It was a catastrophic event in terms of buildings, land, landmarks, and significant places lost.
So what is probably the most significant thing that was lost?
Probably most significant, I'm actually looking at a picture of its replacement right now, is St. Paul's. There was a church, Old St. Paul's is what we call it now, on that site. But that's probably the most significant, the most iconic thing that got lost in the Great Fire of London.
And I'm just looking here at some of the statistics I'm looking at the Wikipedia article, which we often include Wikipedia links just because it's easy that's an easy way to cover the what did. But the estimate is approximately 13,000 homes, give or take. So the estimates there are about 70 to 80,000 people living in those homes that were displaced. A number of churches, somewhere on the order of maybe as many as 80.
Yeah, 50 to 80
parish churches. St. Paul's Cathedral being the large thing that's there, didn't actually reach some of the major palaces, although they were threatened, right?
They were threatened. I mean, the good thing about London is there's this big river in the middle of it, so some of the things that were on the other side of the river were spared. Actually, I've seen several paintings where people are sitting in boats on the river watching the fire burn because they got on the river to escape to the other side. So.
Okay, so obviously a substantial event when you have, again, I mentioned that there were maybe approximately 400,000, 500,000 inhabitants of London. 100,000 of them potentially die from the plague, and now you have another 100,000 of them that are displaced from their homes.
Yep.
So obviously a pretty large event. So to say that event had impact just as an event should be just a given, right?
Right.
So... And like is so often the case during counterfactuals, the removal of the event may not be as impactful as the event itself was. But we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the potential things that would have been the impacts if the event had been removed.
Yes.
Okay, so let's figure out what our fork's going to be here. We didn't even talk about this off podcast. So we're just going to assume that there is no fire at that time, right?
Right, or some of the things I read in terms of research, it's like, okay, there's a fire because fires kind of happen all the time, but it's quickly put out. So we're not having the spread of the fire, maybe.
And one of the things that I remember reading was that one of the mayor of London is actually sort of blamed for not taking
it seriously
or decisive action, because a common way of fighting fires even today, forest fires are fought this way, is to just create a fire break.
Right.
Because what is the city mostly composed of in terms of construction materials?
Wood. Kindling.
Yeah, basically kindling. And so part of the way that you keep it from spreading when you don't have modern fire suppression systems, the ability to move large amounts of water, fire engines, all the things that we think of as being modern firefighting technique. It's tough to put out a fire today with all of those modern techniques and all those modern capabilities. But one of your best defenses is you can't really bring enough water or bring enough to put out the fire per se, so you limit its spread by intentionally destroying property, creating a fire break. At least one of the things that I read was the mayor of London was not maybe as decisive about that as he should have been, and that's what allowed the fire to spread. And once the fire began to spread, it was too late to do much about it.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to assume that our point of departure is there might have been a fire, but not the devastating quality of fire. So not the absence of fire, but the
succession of fire.
And the extent of the fire is what we're going to use as the break. So we're going to assume that there's not more than maybe a couple of dozen homes that are lost. Certainly no major landmarks are there.
Right.
So what we have is now in 1666, London coming out of September 1660, coming out of the backside of the impact of the plague. Mm-hmm. There's no major fires. So what is the first point of departure that you think about on this alternative timeline? What would have been different in London without the fire, Lex?
So the first major thing that pops into my head is if we don't have things being destroyed, we don't have things being rebuilt.
Okay, so what was rebuilt in the real timeline?
Well, of course we have those houses that are all rebuilt, but we also have a lot of churches and a lot of company halls, guild halls, things like that. So kind of the center of commerce for the city was rebuilt, and they were all rebuilt in stone.
Okay, so the main thing that you have there is you get rid of all of the wooden structures, and that creates the opportunity to replace them with
stone.
And logically replace them with stone, because stone's not going to burn.
Right.
And so there's a twofold difference there. One is you don't have to you have a mass scale demolition in the form of the fire, so you don't have to demolish things. And then you change the nature of the primary building material. So London, for the most part, or large parts of London, become a city of stone that had previously been a city of wood.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Okay. So one of the differences is just that.
Yes. Simply, and when you rebuild with the thought in your head of building those natural fire breaks. Of maybe let's not build the houses so close together. Maybe let's give a little bit more space so if a fire does break out in one of those houses, there's less of a chance of it jumping to the next house and the next house and starting this domino effect.
Okay. And one of the things that I think about here, a city that I have visited here in the United States, which also had a major fire, would be the city of Chicago. And if you are familiar with Chicago, you know that the way that Chicago exists today, with a lot of the large, the large park spaces, for example, the large green spaces, public spaces that exist in Chicago, that is not what Chicago looked like before the fire.
Right.
Chicago was remade in terms of its layout, its design, and everything as a result of having a fire, having this catastrophic event that led to something that probably would not have happened the same way on its own, and certainly would not have happened in a large scale sense.
Right.
Another example of that actually just popped in my head, because apparently this happens regularly. And this is the less than modern approach to urban planning is let's all burn it down. As I'm thinking about to Rome in the mid 60s
Yes.
AD, when Nero wanted to make some changes, and so
just burn the city.
Perhaps he set fire, and then of course famously fiddled while the city burned. So again, the initial change may not seem like a big thing in terms of really thinking through the what if, but it's just that you have a different London.
Right. And London is one of those cities that's so iconic. When you just say like, oh yeah, well of course they would have rebuilt it and it would have looked different. But the fact that it wouldn't be rebuilt probably in the way that we know London today. If we have a delay of a fire, let's say, a fire happens decades, centuries later, we would have had different architects rebuilding the city. So the London that we know of that's so iconic and so recognized wouldn't exist, which is it's a simple thing to say, but it's also a big thing.
Yeah, and the section of London that we're talking about here, I've never visited London, so I'm going to rely upon Alexis, who's been there more than once, is that the fire did not quite make it to, as I understand by looking at maps, did not quite make it to the area that the Tower of London is encompassed by, but it did extend all the way down that side of the Thames, of course, including St. Paul's, which is a notable thing today, and actually covering the area where London Bridge actually crosses.
Yes.
Just, again, based upon the maps and my understanding where that crosses the Thames. So this is in central London. This is not in the outskirts.
Yeah, this isn't in, not that London has boonies, but it's not in the boonies. It's in central London.
Okay. And in areas, again, that were already places that were centers of commerce and centers of trade and other things that were there.
Yes, and it didn't burn the tower. It got close to the tower. It got close to some of those buildings, and it fortunately didn't get quite there.
Okay. So the immediate obvious what if is a different look and feel to London. But that's not the only thing that may be changed, because it does tie, and the place we're going to go next here is actually relates to the fact that London needed to be rebuilt and how that might have changed other things in history.
Yes.
So the rebuilding of London, just a spontaneous event, a whole bunch of people get together and just decide they're going to build whatever, wherever?
No, it was a process.
It was a process. And so as I understand it, it was Charles II is the king.
Mm-hmm.
And so this effort to rebuild, redesign what this area of London would be sort of fell under royal charter and under a lot of control there, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're going to rebuild things, and particularly important things like St. Paul's, like a cathedral, you probably need somebody to actually design what that's going to look like, an architect, right?
Yes.
So who is, wasn't the only one, but who is probably the most well-known of the architects that is part of this rebuilding process that comes to be because of the fire?
That would be Christopher Wren.
Christopher Wren. So what do we know about, what can you tell us about Christopher Wren?
So when the fire breaks out in September of 1666, he is up the road at Cambridge studying science. He had dabbled in architecture and was pretty well known for his architectural work at that point, but he was focused on science. But when the fire breaks out, and after the fire is put out and it's determined that we need to rebuild the city, Charles II commissions Christopher Wren to come down from Cambridge to lead that project.
Okay, so someone who was well known in the scientific community at at Cambridge is in the form of Christopher Wren.
Mm-hmm.
Leaves his his primary pursuit being academic pursuits, scientific pursuits. As I was reading through some of his biography, we'll of course include some links there in the show notes to that. But he was known for his works in areas like optics and magnetism and mechanics, these types of things, engineering and science.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves primarily pursuing that to take on the responsibility for doing the design and the architecture work.
Yes.
And the nature of that work, how much has been destroyed, the importance of rebuilding St. Paul's
Yes.
is takes a lot of his time.
Yes.
And so even though he may still be dabbling in science, so to speak, that's not his primary occupation.
Correct.
Okay, so who else is at Cambridge or is involved in scientific efforts about that time?
This little-known guy named Isaac Newton.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, I have too.
So what are some of the things that Newton, of course, is famous for?
Gravity.
Yeah. He didn't invent it.
He didn't invent it, but he did discover it.
You know, or at least some of the computations and the explanations of how it worked. Calculus, optics, a lot of the things that we know. A whole branch of physics. Mm-hmm. Physical physics is known as Newtonian physics. And it's been argued that calculus, or the elements of calculus had existed with others being involved, but that he sort of had to invent calculus as a form of math to be able to explain or do other things.
Right, yeah.
Astronomy, all types of things like that. So we know about this guy named Isaac Newton.
Mm-hmm.
And he's considered one of the most prolific scientists of all time. Now, we're not suggesting in this what-if timeline that Isaac Newton would have just not done anything in the area of science.
No.
But what are we potentially suggesting?
Well, if Wren doesn't have to leave Cambridge, he's also able to work on science, and he was working on a lot of the same things that Newton was working on.
And a little bit ahead of Newton in time on working on them.
Yes. So it's possible that if Wren never has to do this diversion architecture path, we could have a Wren Principia?
Okay. Instead of Newton's Principia, okay. Or we could talk about the famous sort of story of how the concepts of gravity, thinking about gravity, where
Wren's laws of gravity.
Yeah, Wren's laws of motion, or maybe we're talking about Wren getting an apple on the head, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So under that scenario, again, we're not suggesting that there is no Isaac Newton and that Isaac Newton doesn't contribute. A man of Newton's brilliance probably would have, definitely.
And there's probably, they probably would have worked together on some of these things.
Well, that's about where I was going to go, is that, so often in situations like this, there's an individual, exceptional scientific mind that's involved. But that doesn't mean that there would not have been the possibility for collaboration, or that even if it's not collaborative, the competition that may have arisen between the two of them may have pushed one or the other to do unique or different things.
Or do we have things that were discovered, later on down the timeline? Do we have them being discovered faster because of that competition and them trying to beat each other?
Okay, so again, if there's no Great Fire of London, we're sort of suggesting two possible outcomes on the history of science as we know it. And those are basically summarized as much more of a role. We may, again, have this guy named Christopher Wren that we hold in some area or level of esteem similar to that's held by Isaac Newton, and by Wren's preeminence, or by him being bigger in science than he is or we think of him being today, we may have seen a reduction in the impact of Newton.
Yes.
Okay. That's pretty significant.
Pretty significant.
Yeah, at least even it's just, again, the way that we talk about things, not Newton's laws of motion, but Wren's.
I've got Sheldon Cooper in my head. He'd probably, I don't know what his reaction to this would be.
Yeah, so if in another what-if world where the Big Bang Theory is real, and they were to listen to this podcast, it's interesting to think what their responses might be. And again, just to explore that a little bit more before we jump to a different topic, is the idea, as I was reading more about Wren's history, the idea of, yes, there had been architects. There was architecture, no doubt about that before that. But this idea of bringing a scientific element and mathematical element in quite the same way to architecture, Wren is somewhat unique in that from what I understand.
He is, and I'm again, just thinking about features that are in St. Paul's Cathedral, the St. Paul's Cathedral that Wren designs, one of the things is the Whispering Gallery, which is up in the dome. If you're standing on one side of the Whispering Gallery and you're talking to somebody on the other, they can hear exactly what you're saying, as if you were sitting next to each other. So that perfectly ties in with his scientific mind, the fact that he was able to design this perfect circle that you can be standing on one side and talk to someone on the other.
Yeah, as I was reading some of the other things about sort of the things that he brought it's not that, again, that there weren't architects, but architects weren't thought of as being engineers in quite the same way or having the same mathematical or scientific background. He had a tremendous understanding of geometry.
Yes.
So he brought that understanding of geometry to architecture. In fact, because of other things that I've been engaged with here recently, sort of the understanding about how a lot of, it's a strange thing to say, but a lot of architecture and even engineering principles inside of architecture that we designed today were almost accidental.
Yes.
Somebody stumbled into discovering that this worked or copied it from something else. In fact, if you look at a lot of Renaissance architecture, it's rediscovering things that the Romans had used or other cultures had used previously. Mm-hmm. And so Wren, as an architect, bringing the scientific element of architecture into play because of what his background was, probably certainly has more of an influence on architecture. He did influence that maybe more than he influenced the areas of science that he could have influenced if he had been Newton instead of Newton.
Right. It's just diverting the scientific discovery to a different venue, in this case architecture.
Right. So again, the fire definitely changes the course of one particular life, the life of Christopher Wren.
Yes.
And changing that has the potential to ripple out and change other things as well.
Yep.
But it also made changes to the way that business worked and commerce worked inside of the city of London. So all of these people, these roughly 13,000 wooden homes, the next day they, of course, didn't have a phone to pick up, but they walked down to the office of their local insurance agent and they filed their claim to have their homes rebuilt, right?
They didn't know what insurance was.
Wait a second. So you're telling me that all of these people lost their homes, and they had to then replace their belongings and where they were going to live, and they didn't have the benefit of this thing that we think of today as being property insurance to go and do that with.
That would be correct.
That seems like that would have been pretty disruptive.
A little bit.
Yeah. So because that didn't exist, we're sort of obviously a little tongue-in-cheek here, because that reality didn't exist, what actually did come into existence? Insurance. So it's been argued by some writers and historians in the area. I guess there are insurance historians. It's strange to think of that.
I think there's historians for everything. Yeah. So,
but they talk about the rise of what we think of as being modern insurance is heavily influenced by the Great Fire of London.
Yeah, in fact, you were doing some... It was funny. You were doing some research on insurance companies that came up as a result of the Great Fire of London, and you found one company that would give people a plaque to put on their house, and so if a fire broke out, the people who came to put out the fire would know they have insurance and that house doesn't.
Yeah, well, yeah. In fact, this became apparently the norm here. Is some of the first insurance companies were fire insurance companies, where you could take out a policy to protect your home against the risk, or to replace it in the case of the risk of fire. So obviously you paid premiums. But that in addition to that, the insurance company needed to limit its risk. I mean, that insurance was not a new concept. Insurance and risk management actually goes back. There's a great book from the 1980s. Well, great is maybe an overstatement, but an interesting book called The Remarkable Against the Gods. It talks about the story of risk management. And I remember reading that several decades ago and talking about just the historical development of this concept called insurance. And it existed before. But the modern concept of insurance as we know it now is that you take a premium, you take in money, and the expectation you're going to have to pay it out, but then you do things to mitigate and adjust that risk. So you look at things like what are the percentage, the likelihoods of things happening. If it's life insurance, actuarial tables, someone of a certain age, what is the expectation for how long they should live? And then you do this process called underwriting where you evaluate the risk and decide what the appropriate amount of money to take in as a premium is, given the risk that you had of actually paying the money out.
Yep.
Well, one of the other things that actually develops here very quickly in London with these fire insurance companies is one of the ways to mitigate your fire risk is to actually create a mechanism that responds to the risk.
To fight the fire.
To fight the fire. So what you actually have for the first time is you actually have fire companies that are equipped and other technology is brought to bear. Their sole responsibility is to respond to a fire. But these are not quite yet the public fire companies that we're so familiar with. These are private fire, well, hence the term, companies that are organized to respond. And if given a choice and they're being funded by your insurance company, they want to put out the fire at your house or the one that's next to your house, which is putting them at risk first.
Yes.
And so actually what you would get is not just a certificate, a piece of paper that said you had a policy. They would actually put this plaque or marker on your house so that the fire company would recognize where the risk was and then how to respond to it, because they didn't have a responsibility to just do for
put out
anyone.
Any fire.
Right. But they were actually there to put out the fire that was relevant to you. And I think that's just a fascinating concept, is that not only was the concept of insurance, which becomes a very important concept, not just for individuals, but for business in general. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, because that's one of the other things that flows from it. But just in general, that the idea of a fire company, something that is actually designed, that's not just the mayor of London deciding which houses to knock down to create a fire break, but there's actually a response to a fire, also grows out of the Great Fire of London.
Yes.
So, having known that, insurance at the personal level comes out, but it doesn't take long for something else to happen. What's the something else that happens?
What is the something else that happens?
This little company, there's this little place that's basically think of it as a modern coffee shop.
Oh, Lloyd's.
Yeah, Lloyd's of London.
Yeah.
It comes out of that. And so there you have a very different type of insurance, but in that case, because the concept of insurance has become more widespread, there's this place where a lot of mariners and those that own vessels gather. And so actually the underwriting of marine voyages and marine activity starts happening at
Lloyd's of London.
Lloyd's of London.
It becomes the thing where it's like, well, that was a disaster, and we have insurance for that. Hey, there's other types of disasters.
Yeah, in fact, I love the the reason that it's called Lloyd's is it was actually a coffee house, Lloyd's Coffee House, which is where sailors and merchants and ship owners tended to be, and so it became informally the place that these arrangements regarding insurance would happen, and then it grew into a
bona fide company.
It grew into a business, yeah, and of course then becomes one of the largest, most well-known insurers in the world. So if there's no Great Fire of London, where the concept of insurance becomes more widespread because of the response for the need for fire insurance, and then other types of property insurance as well, you might argue that it may be a much longer period of time before the formal business and liability insurance markets actually mature and develop.
Correct. I think that you kind of need this catastrophic catalyst, like the Great Fire, to kind of get that rolling. So I think if you don't have the Great Fire, you don't have the thought of insurance becoming so much more widespread and so much more mainstream.
Right. And so that changes, again, the way that society works,
mm-hmm.
and it changes the way that business works. And if again, would we eventually have had insurance? The answer, of course, is
yes.
Yes. It's hard to imagine that would not have eventually have evolved. But would it have evolved when it did, where it did, how it did?
No.
If it's not for the catalyst of the Great Fire of London.
I don't think so.
So, for example, Lloyd's, which happens to be in London, the place that insurance is already, this grows, it's really only a couple of decades. We're in the 1680s when this comes to prominence. So it's less than 20 years after the Great Fire. If it doesn't grow there, maybe it grows in some other European city because they have a fire.
Right, yeah.
Or something else. And so Lloyd's eventually is not just a London enterprise. It's the world's, for a number of centuries, essentially becomes the world's premier underwriter. And then you get into this thing called reinsurance, which is where insurance companies go to get insurance because they're issuing insurance. All of that comes out of Lloyd's, and Lloyd's, I think, can be arguably shown to be a direct product of the Great Fire of London.
Definitely, and also we're talking about going globally. If we're looking at 1660s, guess what Britain is doing? They're exploring around the world. So I think if we don't have the Great Fire of London as the catalyst, to make insurance become this global thing. Is it possible that we have Spain? Is there a city in Spain where a fire happens and then, the preeminent insurance company is a Spanish company? Is it a Dutch company? Is it some other company and then that influence of, as we have colonies and things like that, that's interesting to think about.
Yeah. Well, in fact, you already do have that in the case of, in the Dutch, there's the Dutch East India Company, this idea of a lot of the exploration and then the commercialization of the discoveries in the New World directly from this idea of interests coming together to pool their money and thus spread the risk.
Yes.
And so, for example, you're going to have a venture that's a trade venture where 10 different companies, 10 different individuals put money up with the understanding that they're going to have a share in the profits, but they're also only assuming 1/10 of the risk that would have been there. And so this concept does have an impact on the way that trade and exploration and the commercialization happens from there. And again, as we've talked about before, in 1666, there is no fire brigade. There is no fire equipment. And so one of the things that actually happens as a result of this through the private companies, and then eventually that becoming a public good,
yes,
is that you have public firefighting companies.
Yep.
And that actually becomes the norm, that a city, as part of its existence, forms and creates and then eventually funds and makes professional those types of organizations.
Yes.
So that becomes the catalyst. So you have a fire department or you have a fire brigade. Well, what else becomes part of what is resulting from a city? Well, you had law enforcement before, but that's also changed by the same model as well. So again, if there's no Great Fire of London, there's no, first of all, there may not be an Isaac Newton in the way that we think of Isaac Newton. You would still have a different look and feel, maybe a different architectural style to large parts of London. No insurance business, and you may not have the result of fire companies coming into being until some later point in time.
Correct.
Any other things you can think of that are major departures, Lex?
Those are the big ones. As I keep staring at this photo, because St. Paul's is so iconic, I'm really having a hard time wrapping my brain around the fact that London wouldn't look like London as we know it today. That's throwing me off.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so what we're saying in here is sometimes a big major fire is
it's a good thing sometimes.
It's a good thing sometimes. Certainly it's an impactful thing. And again, thinking about the example of Chicago, thinking about other locations that have been changed or morphed by a large event like this, while the events themselves are catastrophic, and you said there was very little loss of life.
Yeah, I don't want, you actually queued me up for what was running through my head. I don't want to discount those 10 lives. We did have 10 people that did die in the fire, and I don't want to discount because one life is too many. But yeah, in terms of human life loss, this was actually a very small impact with the Great Fire of London. But I don't want to discount that at all.
Right.
Again, one life is too many.
Well, and then you might easily argue that because of the changes, the creation of fire companies, the city being rebuilt, or that portion of the city being rebuilt in stone versus fire, the net life exchange because of those 10 that were lost might have been certainly a plus.
Right, yeah.
Over a period of time. I guess one thing we should mention here, because we didn't talk about this, we talked about the plague. One of the things that is sometimes attributed to the Great Fire of London as also being a potential benefit of it was what?
It killed the rats.
Yeah, and that it may have actually brought an end to the plague.
Yes.
Now, if you look back, more historians tend to argue now when you look back what the trends were and what was happening, the plague was already probably reducing in its impact and was probably waning in terms of what was there. So this idea that the Great Fire of London saved an even more catastrophic...
Yeah, the Great Fire of London did not stop the plague.
Right, the plague was already in a diminishing form prior to that. However, it might be argued that, as was often the case I mentioned before with the plague outbreaks...
It might have stopped a resurgence.
Correct. Is that you mentioned the rat population that's been destroyed now in these stone buildings versus the wooden buildings. There's less of the possibility of having large populations that would have been the spread of the plague. And so while it may not have been the catalyst for ending the Great Plague of 1665, 1666, it may have played a role in there not being a reemergence or a very large expansion of the plague that would have been a recurrence that could have happened maybe later that year in 1666 or in the coming years.
Yes, and also we mentioned killing off the rats. Also, when we're rebuilding the city, we're naturally rebuilding houses farther apart. So part of the reason why the plague was so catastrophic is it was because things were so compact. It was that domino effect of one house got sick, the next house got sick, the next house got sick. So also we're killing the rats, but also we're spreading things out so we're not as congested, and germs don't have as easy of a time spreading from house to house.
Right. So while I think we would both agree based upon the research that we did and the things that we read to say that the Great Fire ended the Great Plague is probably not fair, but it may have prevented a future outbreak that would have been another instance of plague that could have happened very soon.
Right.
Okay, good deal. All right. So I don't think I have anything else. If you don't have anything else.
I don't.
All right. So we appreciate you joining us here today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Good to have Alexis back on the show. We appreciate, as always, your patronage as a listener. So, Alexis, if somebody wants to learn more about the podcast, where can they go?
aforkintimepodcast.com, and the A is important, and the podcast is important to get you to the right place.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have, of course, is the website. Again, it's not going to win any awards, but it serves pretty functionally for what's there. So if you have some thoughts about today's episode, we would encourage you to go there and leave us some feedback. We like getting the feedback. It doesn't have to be positive feedback. We like positive feedback. But it doesn't have...
Constructive is good, too.
Constructive is good, too. And we've changed and altered some of the things that we do as a podcast as a result of that constructive feedback. Another thing you can do, we don't often mention this as frequently as we should. I'm going to mention it now. We talk about going to the website. Doing ratings and reviews on the podcatcher or the aggregating source that you get the podcast through. So if you get it through Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Stitcher or... any of all the places we are, and we're all over the place, many of them have the ability to either leave a rating, 1 to 5 stars. 5 is good. We would like 5. 5 is good. But also leave a review. And where those are particularly valuable, as folks are looking for the podcast, that will either, A, let them know
yes,
that it's something they may be interested in. When they see a 5-star review, they're much more likely to at least give the show a try than if they see a 1.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I understand, and it's all part of a mystery, and they won't reveal all the things that go on behind the scenes, but in many instances, those ratings and reviews help the podcast appear more prominently in the search engines that are associated there.
Yes.
And so it helps people find the podcast. One of the things that we'll actually have here in a couple of weeks, I'll go ahead and tease it now, is, as you know, as many of you know, particularly those that have listened to the show, our listeners have become part of the contributors and part of the process here, and we love that fact. In addition to that, I had an outreach about a month ago from somebody who was actually starting their own podcast about, guess what?
Alternative history?
Alternate history. And so they reached out to us, and they're just starting now. He reached out to us. He's just starting now, and sort of said, hey, I'm about a year behind you guys, so you probably have some things you learned that I'd love to talk to you about. So I had a chance to talk to him, and so sometime in the coming weeks, our plan is to actually have Brady on to contribute on a show and tell you a little bit about his podcast. But I mentioned that because he found us as a result of a search.
Yes.
And so eventually, I think I probably would have found him as a result of a search. But we can help each other out, and as we've talked about so many times around the podcast, this is not a competition.
No.
It's a community. So we welcome that podcast. By the way, is called What If. So if you want to go looking for it now, I encourage you to do so. But just the type of thing that you leaving a rating or review can also help with us, help others find the podcast as well.
But I also don't want to discount just having a good old-fashioned conversation with people, because I did that about a week ago, and I might have found 2 more listeners.
Hey, we'll count them. We'll include them to the mix. And then, of course, we also have social media. So we have our page on Facebook, Twitter, the other ways that you can get the word around. And of
Maybe
course,
3.
Yeah, exactly. And if you are so inclined, one of the things you can find find in the show notes, but also find at the podcast website, aforkintimepodcast.com, is you can also find the link to our Patreon page, which if you're so inclined and are able to do so, an opportunity for you to support the podcast financially. So lots of ways that you can participate with us there on the website. Anything that we miss?
I think that's all of it.
I think that's
There's
all.
a lot of stuff on that website.
There is, and certainly our entire back catalog. So if you're new to the podcast and want to go looking through, finding episodes that might be of interest to you, It's always amazing to me because the statistical feedback that we get on the podcast, it's always amazing to me to see which episodes trend, and they trend often very much outside of the rest of the trend. You can sort of see the historical trend. We have more listeners now than we did a year ago. That's not a surprise. But a good example is the first episode in our Hurricane series, A Protestant Wind, has already leaped to being like number 6 on our, even though it's only been 3 months.
Yeah.
It's actually leaped to being like number 6 all time. It always astonishes me which topics get the traction there. So we will look at that to determine what future topics ought to be. So unless you want us looking at that, if you want us talking about something else, giving us feedback's the other way to make that happen.
True.
Yeah. All right. So again, we want to thank you again despite all those other things we mentioned, ways that you can support and help promote the podcast. Most importantly, we want to thank you for your time once again. And it wouldn't be a Fork in Time, and it wouldn't be closing out a Fork in Time right if we didn't do it the way that we prefer to do it. In fact, I actually had somebody mention to me, hey, you forgot to do that on a podcast.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so we know when Alexa's on, we have a better than even chance of going to England. We also know that some of you have become very accustomed to how we close out the podcast. So how do we close out the podcast, Lex?
With our little adage that we've adapted just a little bit, our Yogi Bear adage. I know he's Yankee. I'm sorry. But we encourage you that if you find a fork in time, what should you do?
I think you should probably take it.
Good advice.
Good deal. All right. Thanks, guys. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.